There's a particular kind of man who has decided, at some point, that nothing and no one will ever matter enough to get through the armor. Marcus Vail was that man. He had run Detroit's industrial underworld for 20 years without raising his voice, without losing his composure, and without letting anyone close enough to matter. Then a 35-year-old independent auditor found a number on line 17 of a financial appendix that she probably should have ignored. She didn't ignore it. And he, the man who controlled an entire city, who was quietly dying of a disease he'd told no one about, who had spent 15 years believing the only woman he'd ever loved was dead, found himself in a parking garage one evening sending two men away with a single word, looking at someone who looked right back at him like he was a person instead of a force of nature. What happened next is not a love story in the ordinary sense. It is something more difficult and more real than that. It is the story of what it costs a powerful man to admit that the walls he built to survive were also the walls that kept him from living. Some people are born to lead. Some lessons you will never learn in a classroom, in a book, or from anyone who hasn't actually sat in the seat where every decision has weight and every trust has a price. This channel doesn't tell crime stories. This channel tells stories about how the sharpest minds think, how real backbone is built, and what power actually looks like when you get close enough to see it clearly. What this story leaves you with is a question worth sitting with. How many walls have you built that you originally built to protect yourself that are now just keeping everything out? The armor that saved you at 30 might be the thing suffocating you at 45. Marcus Vail didn't become less powerful when he let someone see his hand trembling. He became more honest, and that honesty, that willingness to stop pretending the wall was still necessary, was the thing that finally let him move forward. The lesson is not to be vulnerable. The lesson is to know the difference between a wall that is protecting you and a wall that is just keeping you alone. If something in this story made you think about trust, about the people you keep close, about the stories you tell yourself to get through the hard years, tell us in the comments. We read every one. Share this with someone who is carrying something they haven't put down yet. Like the video, if it gave you something worth keeping. And subscribe, because next week there's another story, another man, another room where everything is about to change. We will be here.
The clock on the wall said 5:47 in the morning. Detroit was still mostly dark outside, the kind of dark that has texture to it, not pure black, but layered. Streetlights going amber. The first delivery trucks moving through empty intersections. Steam rising from a grate somewhere below, catching the orange glow and dissolving into nothing. Marcus Vail stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his 22nd floor apartment and looked at all of it without really seeing any of it. He was holding a cup of coffee in his right hand. He had not taken a single sip. His left hand was in the pocket of his robe. His thumb was turning something small between his fingers. Slowly, the way a person handles something they've touched so many times the edges have gone smooth. He pulled it out, a small white pill, no brand name on it. No pharmacy label you'd recognize. It came from a private dispensary 2 miles north of the city, the kind of place that didn't advertise and didn't ask questions and sent invoices to a company name that didn't trace back to anything real. Marcus looked at the pill in his palm. He did this every morning. Had done it for 8 months now, not because he was refusing treatment, not because he was in denial. He looked at the pill because every morning before he put on the suit and walked into the world where he was Marcus Vail, he needed one moment of absolute honesty with himself. The pill was that moment. It was the truth he carried. He looked at it, acknowledged what it meant, and then he moved on. He put it back in his pocket without taking it, drank the coffee instead. The narrator low and unhurried, as though telling this to someone sitting very close. A man who controls a city learns two things early: what everyone else is afraid of, and how to make sure they never find out what he is afraid of. By 7:30, Marcus was dressed. Charcoal suit, no wrinkles, navy tie. the kind of put together that looks effortless, only because the effort happened years ago when he decided exactly who he needed to look like every single day. The driver was waiting at the curb, had been there since 6 in the morning. Nobody told him to come at 6. He just knew. The first meeting of the day was at 8:15. 3 men in a conference room who had been waiting since 8 o'clock. Nobody sat in the chair at the head of the table. That chair was for Marcus. He walked in, they straightened. Not dramatically, just slightly. The way people do when something with gravity enters a room. He listened to the presentation about a labor contract dispute at a factory in Flint. He asked 4 questions, made 3 decisions. The meeting ended. Nobody argued. There was a second meeting at 10. More complex. Representatives from an outside firm sat across the table. Marcus sat with both hands resting on the surface, relaxed, watching, listening. And then, around the 20-minute mark, his left hand trembled, not violently. Not enough for anyone across to notice. Just a small, involuntary movement, like a single frame of static in an otherwise clean signal. Marcus felt it before anyone could see it. He placed his right hand over his left, unhurried, the way a man might rest his hands while he's thinking. The tremor stopped. Nobody saw, or if they did, nobody looked. After the second meeting ended and the room emptied, Marcus stayed in his chair. He looked at his left hand for exactly 10 seconds, not angry, not frightened, just reading it, the way he would read a number in a report that kept appearing in the wrong column. Noting it, processing it, moving on. The door opened. Leon Ashby came in, 52 years old, silver hair, neatly combed, brown suit, the face of someone's trusted uncle. He had been at Marcus's side for 20 talks, and he moved through this office the way water moves through a space it's occupied, long enough to know every contour of. He placed a fresh glass water carafe on the edge of Marcus's desk. Same spot, every day, a habit so old neither of them registered it anymore. Leon said, "Flint is handled." The union contact agreed to the revised says good, Marcus said. Leon said, "One other thing, Greystone Industrial, they brought in an outside auditor 3 weeks ago."
Independent contractor.
Marcus said, "Her name is Sonia Cross." Marcus said, "What's she found?" Leon said, "Nothing confirmed yet, but she's thorough." "I'm monitoring." Marcus said, "Handle it quietly. No pressure, no contact. Just watch." Leon said, "Always." Leon left. Marcus sat alone for a moment. He looked at the water carafe Leon had just placed on his desk. Looked at it you look at something you've seen every day for so long it's become invisible. Then he picked it up, poured a glass, drank, went back to work. On the other side of the city, in a small office on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like printer ink and old carpet, Sonia Cross was spreading documents across her desk. She was 35. Dark hair, pulled back, 2 monitors, a color-coded filing system that made complete sense to her and baffled everyone else. She was the kind of person who noticed when a staple was placed at the wrong angle on a document, not because she was obsessive, but because to her, details were a language. Everything communicated something. You just had to know how to listen. She opened the Greystone Industrial Contract. First file, standard corporate structure, nothing unusual. Second file, quarterly revenue distribution, clean. Third file, supplemental financial appendix. She stopped on line 17. The number didn't fit. Not dramatically, it wasn't screaming at her. It was just slightly off. The way a note played a half-step flat sounds almost right until you listen closely. She made a note on a yellow sticky. Put a small red dot next to line 17. Opened the next file. Outside her window was moving through an ordinary Tuesday morning. Nobody on that street knew that in a small office on the 4th floor, a woman had just pulled on a thread that was connected to something very large and very carefully hidden, and that the person who had hidden it most carefully was not the man who built it. The last thing a careful man expects, the narrator said quietly, is someone more careful than himself. 3 weeks passed. What had started as a single red dot on a yellow sticky note had become a map. Sonia worked the way she always worked, methodically, without shortcuts, and without reporting before she understood what she was looking at. She'd learned that lesson the hard way 5 years ago, and she didn't intend to learn it again. The map looked like this. Money moved from Greystone Industrial into 7 smaller companies on a fixed schedule, not randomly on a schedule. The same amounts, the same intervals, routed through entities registered in 5 different states, all of them operating in the vague space of logistics consulting or supply chain management. None of them were obviously fraudulent. That was the elegant part. Whoever designed this structure knew exactly where the lines were and had drawn the architecture just far enough inside them to stay technically clean. This was not the work of someone trying to hide money clumsily. This was the work of someone who understood financial law well enough to use it as camouflage. Sonia stood in the middle of her office, with printed documents spread across the floor around her. She needed to see the whole picture at once, not piece by piece, and she felt that particular sensation she had learned not to ignore. Something is here. She didn't report it yet. She wasn't ready. She needed to understand not just what the structure was, but what it was for, who it served. What would happen to the people connected to it if she filed before she had the full picture? That last part. That was new, since 5 years ago. It made her slower. She knew that. It made her more complicated to work with. She knew that too. She believed it was the right price. On the 18th evening of the audit, Sonia left her office at 9:15 at night and walked to the parking garage 1 block south. The city was doing what it did at that hour, not quite quiet, not quite busy, the particular rhythm of a place that never fully goes to sleep. She was halfway to her car when she registered it, a dark sedan, parked near the garage entrance when she'd arrived that afternoon, still there, and when she drove out, it pulled out 4 car lengths behind her. She knew the plate. She had glanced at it when she walked past force of habit, not paranoia. A habit she'd developed years ago because details were her language. She didn't panic. She didn't speed up. She turned left where she normally turned right, took a long route through a residential neighborhood, doubled back to the main road. The sedan followed every turn. She called her friend Daniel from the car, told him she was sending her location and would check in within 30 minutes. Drove directly to a shopping center that was still lit and populated, parked under the brightest lights she could find. The sedan stopped 3 rows away. She sat in her car and waited. 12 minutes later, the sedan left. She drove home, sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold while she thought. So someone knew she was looking at Greystone. The question was how much they knew and who had sent that car. Not the police announced themselves. Not a journalists had no reason. Someone with resources, with access to information about her engagement, and with enough concern about what she might find to spend an evening following her home. That narrowed it considerably. 2 days later, her office was broken into. She knew it the moment she walked in. Not from anything dramatic, the room looked nearly identical to how she'd left it. But there was a pen on her desk that she always positioned at a specific angle when she left for the day. A small habit. A deliberate one. The pen had been moved 3 inches to the left. Nothing was taken. She had never kept important documents at that office. Everything was encrypted, on drives she carried with her, backed up in 3 separate locations. Whoever came in found nothing useful, but that was almost worse, in a way, because it told her they were not looking for documents. They already knew she wouldn't keep them there. They were looking for her. Or they were sending her a message. Or both. Sonia sat down at her desk, opened her laptop, and activated the dead man's switch. It was a system she had built for herself after the situation 5 years ago. Simple in design. If she did not check in to a specific encrypted platform within 72 hours, a package of documents would automatically be sent to 3 pre-designated addresses: a federal oversight contact, an investigative journalist she trusted, and a lawyer she had worked with for years. The package contained everything she'd found on Greystone, organized and labeled. She reset the timer 72 hours from now. Then she kept working. That evening, Sonia left the building at 8 in the evening from a secondary exit she had scouted on her 3rd day of the engagement old habit. Always know your exits, and walked 2 blocks to the parking garage attached to a different commercial building. She was 40 feet from her car when she heard it. Footsteps, from 2 directions. She stopped, assessed. Two men, large, positioned at angles that covered both natural exit paths. They hadn't announced themselves. They didn't need to. Their positioning did it for them. She didn't know whose they were. She was calculating the distance to a stairwell door she'd noted earlier when a figure stepped out from the shadow behind a concrete support column. 15 feet to her left, tall, charcoal jacket. Hands in his pockets. He didn't look at her first. He looked at the two men and said one word, "Go." They went. Not slowly. Not reluctantly. They just left. The way a crowd parts for something with more gravity than itself. Sonia looked at the man who was still standing with his hands in his pockets, watching the garage with the calm of someone who had already done the math on every exit and wasn't worried about any of them. She said, "Who are you?" He said, "Someone who needs to know what you found." She said, "And if I don't tell you?" He said, "Then I have a problem, and problems in my world have a way of becoming everyone's problem." She looked at him for 3 full seconds. Not performing calm, actually assessing. That is the least reassuring thing anyone has said to me all week. And someone broke into my office yesterday. A short pause. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not much. Enough. Are you always this direct after being cornered in a parking garage? I find it saves time. Are you going to tell me your name? Marcus. Marcus what? Just Marcus. For tonight. She studied him. That's not how introductions work. No, he said, but it's how tonight works. The office was on the 8th floor of a building that had no particular identity, not Marcus's territory, not Sonia's, not anyone's that she could trace. A small conference table, overhead lighting, no windows, neutral ground. Marcus had arrived first. He was sitting when she came in, jacket on, both hands resting on the table. No coffee, no phone visible. The posture of someone who had cleared the space of everything except the conversation. Sonia sat across from him. He didn't start with Greystone. He started with her. How long had she been doing independent audit work? What did she do before? Who had given her the Greystone contract? She answered briefly. Enough to not be dismissive. Not enough to give him more than she chose. And while she answered, she watched him. The way he listened still, attentive, processing without reacting. The way he asked questions that seemed simple and weren't. His third question told her he already knew more than she'd assumed. She lost the thread for a moment. Maybe 30 seconds. Then she found it again. She said, "You already know what I found. You're not asking what it is. You're measuring how much I understand what it means." Marcus went quiet. It was a particular kind of quiet, not the silence of someone caught off guard, but the silence of someone recalibrating, adjusting the model they'd been operating with. "Yes," she said, "then let me save us both some time. I understand enough. And I've made arrangements to ensure that what I understand doesn't disappear along with me." He looked at her, not as a threat to be managed, as something else. A consideration that had just changed weight. He laid out the offer. She would stay quiet about Greystone for 60 days. In return, he would shut it down properly, not buried, not shuffled offshore, but genuinely dismantled. The financial structure dissolved correctly. Every worker at Greystone transferred cleanly to other operations, no one losing their job in the transition. At the end of 60 days, she would receive a complete documentation package of everything, the full structure, all 7 companies, every transaction, hers to do with as she chose. She said, "Why 60 days?" He said, "I need time to do it right." She said, "That's a timeline, not a reason." He said, "I'm in the middle of a transition. Things that need to close properly take time." She heard the space inside that sentence, the slight care in how he chose the word transition, the way it carried more weight than the sentence around it needed. She said, "You're stepping down." It wasn't a question. He didn't confirm. He didn't deny. But the quality of his silence told her she was right. She set her own conditions. She said, "I'll stay quiet, but not on faith. Every 2 weeks you give me documentation, confirming the progress. Raw data, not summaries. I verify it myself." He said, "You're auditing me." She said, "I'm auditing the process. There's a difference." For the first time in that room, something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, adjacent to one. He said, "Agreed." She stood. Gathered nothing. ended her sentence. He stood and shook it. His grip was firm, dry, brief. The handshake of someone who meant what they agreed to. She walked to the door. He said, "Sonia." She stopped. He'd used her name without asking permission to use it, not rudely, just as though it had already been established. She turned. He said, "If anyone approaches you about Greystone from another direction, tell me." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because if someone already knows about this arrangement, the problem is bigger than Greystone." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she left. In the elevator going down, she stood and looked at the closed doors. She had just agreed to stay quiet about evidence of financial fraud for 60 days with a man whose last name she didn't know, who had appeared in a parking garage and sent two other men away with a single word, based on a handshake and a promise to deliver paperwork every 2 weeks. She had done it because he had sounded like someone telling the truth. She had done it because 200 workers at Greystone shouldn't be collateral damage in a report filed before she understood the full picture. And she had done it this part she didn't say out loud, not even to herself, not yet, because in a month that had involved someone following her home, someone searching her office, and two men positioning themselves to cut off her exits, this was the first person who had looked at her like she was a person instead of a complication. The elevator doors opened. She walked out into the lobby and back into the city. 2 weeks passed. The first documentation package arrived on a Monday morning in Sonia's encrypted inbox. No sender name. An attachment. 47 pages. She spent 3 hours with it. Every number corresponded with what she'd already found. Every structure she'd mapped was represented. The timeline for dissolution was specific company by company, with projected transfer dates for each employee affected. He had done exactly what he said. She sent a brief confirmation, 4 sentences, professional, acknowledging receipt and accuracy. That same morning, in a different part of the city, Leon stood beside Marcus's desk as Marcus read her reply on his screen. Leon said, "She's going to be a problem." Marcus didn't look up. "She's an auditor doing her job. That's a control, not a problem." Leon said, "Controls can become complications." Marcus said, "Then we make sure they don't." Leon left. He took the small notebook from his inside jacket pocket and wrote a name in it. Sonia Cross. He closed the notebook, replaced it. 1 week after the first package, Sonia found something. Not fraud. Not a new violation. A technical structural error in one of the dissolution timelines, a gap in how one of the 7 companies was being wound down that would, if left uncorrected, create a legal liability that could loop back to individual workers during the transition. Most auditors would have missed it. It was buried in a supplemental filing attachment and required cross-referencing 3 separate documents to see it. Sonia cross-referenced it. She contacted Marcus. They met at a coffee shop. An ordinary 1 wooden tables, warm lighting, the kind of place that had been there for 20 years and would be there for 20 more. Sonia had chosen it. Marcus arrived alone. No security. No one from his organization visible. She noticed this. Leon had objected. She found that out later. Marcus had overruled him because he answered something Leon didn't. Arriving with a formation was a statement of power. Arriving alone was arriving like a person. She explained the error, showed him the 3 documents, walked him through the cross-reference. He listened the way she had come to recognize as his particular way, completely still, not performing attention, actually paying it. He asked 3 questions. Technical, precise, getting to the exact mechanism of the issue each time. He said, "I'll have this corrected before the end of the week," she said. "That's enough time." They sat with their coffee for a moment, not filling the silence, just existing in it. She noticed he was drinking from the coffee shop's cup. Not a personal container, not his own water. Just the shop's coffee, in a regular ceramic mug, like a regular person. She stored that observation without knowing exactly why. He took something from his inside jacket pocket. A small piece of paper. Folded many times over, so many times the creases had gone soft with age. He turned it over and over between his fingers without appearing to notice he was doing it. When her eyes went to it, he set it on the table. Didn't explain. She didn't ask. They talked about the correction, about the timeline. about one of the companies in the structure that needed additional attention. At the end of the meeting, Marcus reached for his jacket from the back of his chair. He stood and began buttoning it, standard, unhurried, and then his left hand trembled, not a small tremor enough to lose the button. He stopped, released it, waited 3 seconds. The tremor passed. He tried again, fingers steadier now, got the button. Sonia had seen all of it. She continued, putting her phone in her bag at the same pace she had been moving at. She did not look away deliberately. She did not look back at him carefully in that particular way people look when they're pretending not to have seen something. She just continued doing what she was doing. Marcus realized she had seen, and realized she had chosen not to react, not moved to sympathy, not carefully retreating, not performing blindness, just continuing, the same pace, the same attention to her own task. He had been in rooms with people his entire adult life where every movement he made was registered and responded to, where his stillness was interpreted and his attention was sought, and everything he did was processed through the lens of what it meant for everyone else in the room. This was different. He couldn't have said exactly how. But it was. They walked out of the coffee shop separately. That evening, in a medical office across the city, Grace Calloway was looking at a set of test results on her desk. She had been Marcus's doctor for 12 years. She had delivered his diagnosis 8 months ago in this same room, and she had watched him receive it the way he received everything still, processing, asking exactly the questions that mattered. What she was looking at now was not consistent with the diagnosis, as it should have been progressing. The rate of deterioration over the past 3 months was almost double what the medical literature described for this condition at this stage. Not impossible, every patient was different, but unusual. Unusual enough that she had pulled comparable cases from research databases and read through them twice. Not one of them showed acceleration like this. She picked up her phone, called Marcus. He didn't answer. She left a message asking him to come in this week. Then she sat at her desk for a moment longer. Opened her desk drawer, removed a small specimens collection kit. She was going to need a sample from that water carafe in his office. 3 days after the coffee shop meeting, Marcus received a request from Victor Rains. A brief meeting, 45 minutes, maybe an hour, to work through a dispute over a shared shipping arrangement in the northwestern corridor of the city. Not a crisis, not a confrontation, just business. The kind of thing that came up every few months between two operations that shared geography and occasionally shared interests. Marcus agreed. The location was a private dining room at a restaurant they had both used for neutral meetings before. Quiet, appropriate. Neither man's territory. What Marcus did not know was that Leon had mentioned, in passing conversation earlier that week, that the Greystone auditor would be in that district of the city that evening. He had framed it as incidental, something noted in the course of monitoring, something Victor might find interesting. Leon had calculated that Victor's interest in the information would create a useful complexity, that Marcus would be required to navigate it, that navigating it would cost him focus he would otherwise spend looking inward at his own organization. Leon had miscalculated completely. The meeting started at 7 in the evening. Victor Rains was 51. He had the particular ease of a man who had gotten what he wanted often enough that the idea of not getting it felt genuinely novel. He ran his operation efficiently. He was not cruel in ways that created unnecessary enemies. And he had maintained a working relationship with Marcus Vale for close to 15 years, based on a mutual understanding that each of them was better served by the other's stability than by the other's instability. He ordered a scotch. Marcus ordered water. They went through the shipping dispute, the territory in question, the route in question, the financial arrangement that both sides had different memories of agreeing to. It was the kind of thing that in another world would have been handled by lawyers. In this world, it was handled by the two principals in a private room, with very good food, and an implicit understanding that whatever was decided here would stay decided. They were nearly through it. Maybe 10 minutes left of productive conversation. And then Sonia Cross walked into the restaurant. She wasn't there because of Marcus. She didn't know he was there. A colleague had recommended this restaurant months ago, and tonight her friend had chosen it for a dinner that had nothing to do with audits or Greystone or any of the things that had been occupying her evenings for the past several weeks. She was crossing the main dining room on her way to a table on the far side. She was wearing dark clothes, her hair down, and she was already smiling at something her friend had said before they'd even sat down. Victor looked up. He watched her cross the room. Then he turned back to Marcus, with the ease of a man who has never been taught that there are things that should not be said, and he said it. She's hot, casual, completely casual. The tone of someone commenting on a nice car parked outside or an interesting piece of art on the wall. He had already looked back at his drink. Marcus did not move. He set down his water glass, slowly, and then he was still. Victor, who had known Marcus Hasvale for 15 years and had learned to read the particular frequencies of his moods the way a sailor reads weather, felt the temperature in the room change. He looked up. Marcus was looking at him. Not angry, not loudly. Something quieter and more final than anger. The expression of a man who has just drawn a line and is looking at the other person to make sure they understand exactly where it is. Marcus said, "She's mine." Low, measured. Each word placed deliberately, the way you place something fragile on a surface and make sure it's stable before you let go. Victor went very still. 3 words. That was all. But Victor understood, because he had been in enough rooms with enough powerful men to know the difference between a man protecting a possession and a man protecting a person. This was the second thing. And the second thing, in his experience, was always more serious. He said nothing. The meeting concluded 8 minutes later. Victor left first. Marcus sat alone at the table. He looked in the direction of the table where Sonia was sitting with her friend. She was laughing. Whatever her friend had said was funny, and she was laughing at it, genuinely, the way people laugh when they're not thinking about being watched. Marcus sat with his water glass in front of him and understood what had just happened inside himself. He had not said, "She's mine," for Victor's benefit. He hadn't calculated it as a signal or a warning or a piece of information to be communicated strategically. He had said it because it was true. Because in the moment Victor spoke those words, something in Marcus had responded with a clarity he hadn't felt in 15 years. She mattered to him. That was the simple version. The version that the rest of the sentence didn't complicate. The more complicated version was this. For 15 years, Marcus Vale had been very good at not letting anything matter in that particular way. He had decided, after Diane, that the cost of that particular kind of mattering was too high for what he did and who he was and what his life required. He had built the walls carefully, he had lived inside them efficiently. And somewhere in the process, in the 60-day arrangement and the coffee shop, and the way she had continued packing her bag at exactly the same pace after seeing his hand shake the walls, had developed a problem. She hadn't broken them. She hadn't tried to. She had just been herself, clearly and without pretense, in his vicinity often enough that he had forgotten to maintain a particular vigilance. And now he was sitting in a private dining room, looking at a woman who didn't know he existed tonight. And he understood that she was the first person in 15 years he would willingly place himself between and whatever came her way. Not because she needed protecting. He knew better than that. She had a dead man's switch, and a color-coded filing system, and a mind that caught errors, buried 3 documents deep in supplemental dependencies. But because he chose to, because she mattered, and because those 3 words, "she's mine," had not been a performance. He had meant every one of them. He didn't approach her table. He didn't let her know he was there. He left through the side exit and stood in the night air outside for a moment before his driver pulled around. On the way home, looking at the city through the window, he asked himself the question he hadn't wanted to ask. Why now? Why this person? At this particular moment, when everything else was falling apart. The answer came quietly, the way true things often do. Maybe some things don't disappear. Maybe they just wait for the right person to remind you they were always there. The day after the restaurant. Sonia was at her desk at 9 in the morning when her phone rang. The number was from a law firm downtown Castellan and Associates. The man on the line introduced himself as a senior associate representing what he described as a business integrity coalition. He knew her name. He knew she was auditing Greystone Industrial. He knew, in careful language that avoided specific while making the specifics clear, that she had found something significant. He wanted her to file her report now, not in 60 days. Not even in 30, Henry. Now, this week, the coalition was prepared to compensate her at twice her standard rate, paid to a private account, no company intermediary required. Sonia listened to all of it. Then she said no. He said, Ms. Cross, I want to make sure you understand the scope of what we're prepared to offer. She said, I understood it. The answer is no. She ended the call. She wrote down the attorney's name, the firm's name, and the exact wording of 3 key phrases he had used. Then she sat very still for a moment. The question was not whether she was going to report this to Marcus. She was, because it changed the parameters of their arrangement. The question was what it meant. Only 2 people knew about the arrangement, her and Marcus, and she had not told anyone. Which meant either Marcus had or someone who knew everything Marcus knew had told someone else. Those were different problems. Her phone rang again. Different number. Not stored, but she recognized the last 4 digits. She answered. Marcus said, You were approached this morning. Not a question. He already knew. She said, You're watching me. He said, I'm watching everyone who knows what you know. That's not the same thing. She said, Did you know they were going to approach me? He said, No. One word. Flat. But she heard something under it, not defensiveness, not denial. The particular sound of someone arriving at an understanding they were not pleased to arrive at. He said, Which means someone told them. And the only people who knew about our arrangement, she said, are you and whoever you told. A pause. Then he said, I didn't tell anyone. She heard the truth of it, not as a claim to be evaluated, as a fact being stated by someone who understood exactly what it meant and was not looking away from it. She said, So someone told them, because they know everything you know. He said, Yes. She said, And that person is inside your organization. He said, I believe so. The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the silence of 2 people standing on the same side of something they'd both just realized was much larger than it appeared. She said, What are you going to do? He said, Verify, carefully. She understood. In his world, you didn't accuse without evidence. You created conditions under which a guilty person revealed themselves. You planted something specific and watched to see where it surfaced. She said, And, in the meantime? He said, Continue as agreed. If they approach you again, let me know before you respond. She said, Understood. Then neither of them spoke for a moment. She said, Marcus. The first time she had used his name directly, not in the third person, not as a reference. His name, addressed to him. He said, Yes. She said, Are you okay? 3 words, the simplest kind. She had asked them not because she knew about the illness, not because of anything specific she could point to. She had asked them because she had been in enough rooms with enough people to know when someone was carrying more than they were showing, and something in his voice tonight had that weight to it. The particular density of a person holding things they have held alone for a long time. He didn't answer right away. 5 seconds passed. Maybe 6. Then he said, Call me if they approach you again. The line went quiet. Sonia looked at her phone. He hadn't answered, but she had heard the answer anyway. It was in the pause before he redirected. It was in the 5 seconds he'd taken before choosing not to say what the question deserved. The answer was no. She set the phone down and looked at the documents on her desk. She was somewhere past the 30-day mark of their arrangement. 60 days had felt like a long time at the beginning. It didn't feel particularly long anymore. The lab results arrived on a Thursday. Grace had submitted the water sample under a name that didn't connect to her or her practice, or anything traceable to Marcus Vale's mingle. The independent facility was 200 miles away.
She had paid cash.
The results came in a plain digital file, no letterhead, no identifying information beyond reference numbers she'd assigned herself. She read them at her kitchen table at 10 at night. The compound identified in the sample was not a standard toxin. It didn't appear in the common databases of regulated substances. She had spent an hour and a half cross-referencing it against research literature before she found what she was looking for. It was a synthetic derivative of a class of neurological compounds. At the doses present in the sample, small, consistent, carefully controlled, it would produce no dramatic symptoms on its own, no nausea, no obvious pain, nothing that would announce itself. What it would do, over a period of months, was accelerate an existing neurological deterioration. Specifically, precisely, the exact kind of deterioration that Marcus had been diagnosed with 8 months ago. Grace sat at her kitchen table for a long time. Her coffee went cold. She read the results 3 more times to make sure she had not misread them. She had not misread them. She thought about what to do. She could call the police. She could call a lawyer. She could send Marcus the results digitally and let him process them alone. She did none of those things. The next morning, she went to his office without calling ahead. She told the front desk it was a medical matter that could not be rescheduled. She was taken to his office in 4 minutes. Marcus was standing at the window when she came in. He turned when he heard the door. She crossed the room. She placed the lab results on his desk. She didn't explain them in words first. She knew how he processed information. She stepped back and let him read. He picked up the pages. He read. He was quiet for 90 seconds, maybe longer. He set the pages down, looked out the window. 1 minute passed. Then he said, "How long?" Not how long did he have with the illness. That wasn't what he was asking. Grace understood. She said, "Based on the concentration levels in the sample, the compound has been present for approximately 6 to 8 months, possibly longer." He said, "Someone with what kind of medical knowledge would know to use this?" She said, "Advanced. Not general practice, specialized neurological and biochemical knowledge, or access to someone with that knowledge." He said, "The carafe on my desk." She said, "Yes." He said, "Who has consistent, daily access to it?" Grace didn't answer. Because the answer wasn't a question, they both already knew it. After Grace left, Marcus sat alone in his office. He moved the water carafe from his desk to the floor without looking at it, pushed it with his foot until it was beneath the credenza against the far wall. Then he was still for a long time. He took the folded paper from his inside jacket pocket. He opened it. The audience saw it fully for the first time. Handwriting in faded blue ink on a piece of paper that had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases had gone thin as fabric. A Portland address, and beneath it, one line. "Call me when you're ready. D." He looked at it. 15 years. He had carried this piece of paper in every jacket he'd worn for 15 years. He hadn't opened it in 3. He had told himself he kept it because throwing it away felt like a choice he wasn't prepared to make. That was most of the truth. The rest of the truth, the part he'd never said out loud, was that there had always been a 2% part of him that hadn't fully believed what he'd been told. Hadn't been able to make it feel real. Hadn't been able to make Diane Walsh feel like someone who was gone. He folded the paper, put it back. He said quietly to the empty room, "The man who has been at my side for 20 years. The man who loses the most when I step down. The man who has always known everything, including the things no one else was supposed to know." He stood, went to the window, Detroit outside, the city moving, indifferent. Leon understood the test on a Friday afternoon. Marcus had given him a piece of information 3 days earlier. A meeting location, a potential new contact, a specific detail about a possible arrangement in the Northern Corridor. Leon had received it as he received, everything noted it, filed it, followed up quietly. What he had not noticed in the moment was that one element of the information didn't hold together on close examination, a timing detail that contradicted a known logistical reality. A small thing. The kind of small thing Marcus never got wrong. Leon had caught it on the second pass. He sat with the understanding for 2 hours. Marcus was testing him, which meant Marcus suspected him, not confirmed, not certain, but close enough to warrant construction of a trap. Leon was 52 years old. He had been beside Marcus Vale since Marcus was building something instead of running it. He had learned the language of this man, every silence, every word choice, every pause. He knew what it meant when Marcus moved quietly, and he knew that quiet movement was not nothing. He opened the small notebook he kept in his inside pocket. He looked at the name he had written there. Sonia Cross. He picked up a secondary phone and made a call through an intermediary. He said, "Accelerate the timeline. Whatever they're doing with the Greystone auditor, move faster." He hung up. He sat back. He told himself, as he had told himself every time, that everything he had done and was doing was in service of something real. That Marcus needed protecting from his own decisions. That Marcus's instinct to step back and hand things off was a vulnerability, not a choice, and someone had to be clear-eyed enough to prevent it. He told himself that. He had been telling himself that for 20 years. That same evening, Sonia had been tracking it for 3 days. A dark blue sedan, a silver compact, a man in a gray jacket who appeared near her building with slightly too much consistency to be coincidental. She had started keeping a written log on the second day times, locations, partial plates. By the third day, she had 3 vehicles and 1 individual, who had appeared in her proximity on more than one occasion. This was no longer background surveillance. This was preparation. She reset the dead man's switch to 24 hours, sent a status message to her 3 designated contacts flagging elevated risk, and then she called Marcus. She said, "The situation has changed. I've had consistent surveillance for 3 days, 3 vehicles, at least 1 individual on foot. Our arrangement assumed I would be safe during the 60-day period. I am not safe." Marcus said, "Where are you right now?" She said, "My apartment." He said, "Stay there. I'm sending someone to bring you to a neutral location." She said, "I'd rather meet you directly." A pause. He said, "Then I'll come." The apartment he took her to was not his. It was a 2-bedroom unit in a building on the west side that had no connection to his organization in any visible documentation. The kind of space you kept for exactly this kind of situation. Clean, functional, stocked. Sonia arrived at 11 at night. She had a bag with her laptop, her drives, and a change of clothes. She looked tired in the way of someone who was tired of being careful for a sustained period of time, which was a specific kind of tired. They sat at the kitchen table. Marcus laid out the protective arrangement, secure location for the remainder of the 60-day period. 2 people he trusted on rotation in the building. Her dead man's switch would function normally, he wouldn't interfere with it. She listened, asked 2 questions, both practical. He was mid-sentence, explaining the secondary exit protocol for the building, when his left hand knocked the water glass off the edge of the table. It hit the floor and broke. Water across the tile. He looked at his hand. He didn't cover it, didn't fold it away. He just looked at it, the way he had looked at the pill every morning for 8 months, acknowledging the truth without performance. Sonia stood, found a dish towel, cleaned up the glass carefully, collected the pieces, set them in the sink. She moved with the calm efficiency of someone handling a practical situation. When she sat back down, she looked at him. She said, "How long has that been happening?" He said, 8 months, officially. She said, "And unofficially?" He said, "Unofficially, I believe someone helped it along." The kitchen was very quiet. Sonia said, "Have you confirmed it?" He said, "Yesterday." She said, "Do you know who?" He said, "I have a suspicion I don't want to have." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The hardest evidence to accept is the evidence that proves someone you trusted." He said, "Yes, exactly that." They sat with that for a moment. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the folded piece of paper. He placed it on the table between them, didn't open it. He said, "There's something else, something from 15 years ago that I believe is connected to what's happening now. I'm not ready to tell you all of it tonight, but I want you to know it exists." She looked at the folded paper. She said, "Okay." He said, "Okay?" She said, "When you're ready. I'm not going anywhere tonight." He looked at her, not calculating, not reading the room, just looking. The way a person looks at something they have almost gotten used to pretending they don't notice. The morning light came through the windows of the neutral apartment at a low angle. Detroit in early autumn. The kind of light that was pale and clean and made everything look like it was made of something quieter than usual. Marcus was working at the table. Papers, laptop, his phone. The work of an organization that kept moving regardless of what its leader was carrying. Sonia was on the other side of the table, reviewing the latest Greystone documentation. The 45-day package had arrived yesterday. On schedule. Complete. She was turning a page in a physical folder when something slipped out. A photograph. 4 by 6 inches. Printed. Not digital, the kind you'd print from a personal file and keep because you couldn't bring yourself to look at it on a screen. A woman sitting near a window, looking out. Candid angle. She didn't know the camera was there. Afternoon light. Dark hair, loose around her shoulders. Something at the edge of a smile not directed at anyone, just the expression of someone thinking a thought they found quietly pleasant. Sonia picked it up. She looked at it for a long time, 3 years ago. Portland, a small logistics firm. A 3-week audit engagement. One of the company's bookkeepers had been a woman named Helen. Quiet, consistent, professionally precise in a way that stood out in an otherwise unremarkable accounting department. Sonia had spoken with her 5 times during the engagement. Brief, professional. She remembered her not because of the conversations, those were ordinary, but because of one specific thing she had noticed. Every time someone in the office mentioned Detroit in the news, in conversation, casually in passings, Helen changed the subject, not awkwardly, smoothly. The practiced redirect of someone who had been doing it long enough that it no longer required effort. The woman in this photograph was Helen. Sonia was certain. She set the photograph on the table between them. She said, "Who is this?" Marcus looked up, looked at the photograph. Something crossed his face. Fast. There and gone, then neutral again. He said, "Someone I knew a long time ago." She said, "Is she still alive?" He'd said, "No." She said, "Are you certain?" The way she asked it stopped him. Not accusatory, not leading. The tone is of someone who has specific information relevant to the question and is asking because they need to know what he knows before they share what they know. He said, "What are you asking me?" She said, 3 years ago. Portland, a logistics company audit. One of their bookkeepers was named Helen. She redirected every mention of Detroit with the precision of someone who had practiced it for years. She paused. "I'm looking at her right now." Marcus did not move. She said, "She's alive." Or she was, 3 years ago. The silence in the kitchen was the silence of something fundamental shifting position. He stood up, walked to the window, put one hand against the frame and stood there for almost a minute without speaking. She waited. She did not try to fill it. Finally, he said, "I was told she died." "In an accident 12 years ago," she said. "Who told you?" He turned from the window. The expression on his face was not one she had seen from him before. Not the controlled neutrality of his professional self, not the guarded stillness of someone managing information. This was the expression of a man doing math on something he did not want the answer to. He said, "Leon." He called Leon that afternoon. Casual routine. "Come to the apartment, there's something I want to discuss." No urgency in his voice. Leon arrived at 4. Jacket pressed, hair combed. The face of the man who had been at Marcus's side for 20 years. The man who had sat through every difficult conversation and every long night and every moment when the weight of what Marcus carried was visible to the one person, allowed close enough to see it. Marcus had placed the results from Grace on the table before Leon arrived. He didn't say anything when Leon came in. He just gestured to the chair across from him. Leon sat, looked at the papers on the table, looked at them for 3 seconds. Then he sat back in the chair, not because he'd been asked to, because something had left his legs. Leon said, "I never wanted to hurt you." Marcus said, "I know." Leon said, "Everything I did because Marcus said Diane is alive." Leon went quiet. Marcus said, "She's in Portland. Has been for years, living under a different name, redirecting every mention of this city." He paused. "And you told me she was dead." Leon didn't deny it. He sat in the chair with his hands folded in his lap, and he looked at the table between them and he said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I couldn't let her stay." Marcus said, "Tell me." And Leon told him, all of it. About Diane, 15 years ago, how Marcus with her had been Marcus with less need for Leon, how it had not been about power or the organization or anything that could be pointed to in the rational way. It had been about identity. About the fact that the version of Marcus who needed Leon fully was the version of Marcus that Leon had built his entire understanding of himself around. And the version of Marcus who had Diane was complete in a way that didn't require Leon, and Leon had not been able to survive that, so he had created circumstances. Implied threats she wouldn't fully understand, but would find credible enough to leave. She had left. He had waited and watched, and eventually told Marcus she was dead, because searching for a living person would never fully end. About the compound, how he had known about the illness before Marcus was diagnosed, because he had always monitored Marcus's medical appointments. How, when he learned that Marcus was planning to transfer the organization to the next generation, he had understood what that meant, not just professionally. Personally, he would be set aside. And without Marcus needing him, he did not know who he was, so he had found the compound. Administered it carefully, small doses, consistent, enough to accelerate the progression, not to end it. It's because he had never wanted Marcus dead, he had only wanted Marcus to stay. Leon finished speaking. The kitchen was very quiet. Marcus looked at him for a long time. Not with the expression of someone who was about to act violently. With the expression of someone doing the final accounting on something that had been running in the wrong column for a very long time. Marcus said, "You took 15 years from me, from her, from whatever we might have been." Leon said, "I know." Marcus said, "Leave." Leon stood. He looked at Marcus one more time with an expression that was not easily named because it was made of too many things at once. Then he walked to the door and he left. Sonia was in the other room. She came to the kitchen doorway after the front door had closed. She looked at Marcus. He was sitting at the table, hands flat on the surface, looking at nothing in particular. She made 2 cups of coffee and brought them to the table and sat down across from him and did not say anything for a while. He appreciated that more than she would know. Marcus did not have Leon killed. This surprised some people, later or would have, if it had been widely known. In the world he operated in, the expected response to the kind of betrayal Leon had committed was swift and terminal. That was the logic of that world. It had its own internal consistency. Marcus had decided, at the table in the neutral apartment with his hands flat on the surface, and 20 years of history settling into a new shape around him, that he was not going to operate by that logic in this particular case. Not because he was merciful in some abstract way, but because he understood that Leon's real punishment was not something he could deliver. The real punishment was standing in a courtroom, in public, under his real name, being described accurately. Not as the loyal right hand of 20 years. As the man who had poisoned the person he claimed to love, and stolen 15 years from him by telling a lie simple enough to fit in one sentence. He gave all of it to his attorney, the lab results. Grace's documentation, the timeline, the chain of access to the water carafe, everything needed to build a case that a federal prosecutor could work with. He said, "Don't tell him it came from me. He'll understand when the indictment arrives." His attorney, who had known Marcus for 12 years and had learned not to ask certain questions, said he understood and would handle it. 3 weeks later, Leon received paperwork at his front door. He read it. He set it on the kitchen table and looked out the window of the house he had lived in for 18 years. No dramatic reaction. Just a man arriving at the end of a very long road and finding what was waiting there. Grace began Marcus's real treatment the week after Leon left. She had told him, in the direct way that was the only way she knew, that with the compound removed from his system and a course of treatment specifically designed for where the disease actually was not, where it had been artificially accelerated to the progression, would slow considerably. Years, not months, not a cure. The underlying condition was still there. But the picture had changed. He had sat in her office and listened to this and had not immediately responded. Then he said, "Years." She said, "Potentially." "Yes." He said, "I see." It was a very small response for very significant information, but Grace knew him well enough to know that "I see" from Marcus Vale meant something was being genuinely absorbed. Not deflected, not filed away, taken in. He wrote the letter to Diane on a Tuesday evening. by hand on paper, at the kitchen table of the apartment he had moved back into after the neutral location was no longer necessary. He had tried 4 times before getting to the version that said what he needed it to say without saying more than that. It was 3 sentences: I know you're alive. I know why you left. I'm not angry. And then, below it, I just needed you to know that I know. He mailed it through a contact who had no connection to any organization, just a person who sometimes did him small practical favors. He confirmed it was delivered. He did not wait to hear back. He did not expect a specific response on a specific timeline. He had sent the truth. What happened with it next was not entirely his to decide. Greystone Industrial dissolved cleanly at the 58-day mark, 2 days ahead of schedule. Every worker transferred. No disruption to employment. The financial structure unmade the way it had been made carefully by someone who understood the architecture. Sonia received the final documentation package the morning of day 60. She reviewed it in full. It was complete. It was accurate. It was everything she needed. She called him. She said, "The documentation is in order. Our arrangement is complete. I'm keeping the materials." He said, "I know." She said, "Which means this story could still go somewhere. Down the line, depending on what happens next." He said, "I know that too." She said, "And you're okay with that?" He said, "A deal is a deal. You held your side. I held mine. What you do with the information after is yours." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's the most respectful thing anyone in your position has ever said to me." He said, "I need you to be good at your job. People who are good at their jobs need the freedom to do them right, not to be managed." She thought about that. Then she said, "Thank you, Marcus." The last real conversation happened that evening. The neutral apartment again, by informal agreement, because neither of them had suggested ending the habit of occasionally being in the same room. Coffee. At the kitchen table. October now, the city outside going through its seasonal shift, the light changing, the particular Detroit autumn settling into the streets. He said, "I spent 15 years building a wall around something I thought I'd lost. It turns out the wall was the problem." She said, "What do you do when the story you told yourself to survive turns out to be wrong?" He said, "You tell a different story, and you give yourself time to believe it." She said, "How long does that take?" He said, "I don't know yet." She said, "I think it takes as long as it takes. There's no shortcut I've found." He said, "You sound like someone who found that out personally." She said, 5 years ago. A case that went wrong. I was right about the numbers. I was wrong about how they'd be used. Someone got hurt because of information I provided, and I couldn't undo it after the fact." He said, "What happened?" She said, "I rebuilt the process. Added a step. I check every case for human consequence now, not just numerical accuracy. And I check everything 3 times instead of 2. He said, "You didn't stop." She said, "Stopping would have been easier. But stopping would have been the wrong lesson." He looked at her across the table. He said, "That is the most useful thing anyone has said to me in 15 years. She said, "I'll add it to my professional highlights." It was the first time he had laughed. Quietly, briefly, but genuinely. The city outside was settling into evening. Detroit going through its rhythms. The ordinary machinery of a place that did not stop for anyone's personal reckonings. 1 month later. Marcus was working late on a Thursday, old habit, difficult to break, when his phone rang. The area code was Oregon. He looked at the number for a moment, set down his pen, and answered. He said, "Hello?" A pause on the other end. Then a voice he had not heard in 15 years said his name. The conversation was private. The audience heard only his side of it. His voice, quieter than usual, taking its time with each response. He said, "I know. I've known for a few weeks now." A pause. Listening. He said, "I should have looked harder. That's on me." Another pause. He said, "No, I understand why you did what you did. I'm not angry, Diane. I meant what I wrote." He listened for a while, then he said, "Whenever you're ready. There's no timeline. I'm not going anywhere." He set the phone down on the desk. The office was quiet around him. The city outside. The particular stillness of a late Thursday night, in a room where someone has just spoken to a person they thought they would never speak to again, and found that the conversation was possible, and that possible was enough for now. His left hand was resting on the desk. It trembled, slightly, the way it always did at this hour when he was tired and had stopped compensating for it. He looked at it for a moment, then he looked back at the work on his desk, and kept going. 6 weeks later. 3 scenes, no narration needed. Scene 1, Sonia's office. Morning. She is at her desk, both monitors running, a new audit file open on the left screen. Her phone alerts her to a new email. She opens it. The center line shows only initials. The attachment is a financial report on a manufacturing company in Michigan, with a short note in the body of the email. Thought you might find the Q4 numbers interesting. MV. She reads it again, pulls up a comparison file on her second monitor. They're line 23 of the Q4 supplemental. A pattern beginning to form, the kind of thing that most people wouldn't catch. She opens a new email, types a reply. 2 sentences. Professional. With a small precision at the end that he will understand and that carries, if you know how to read it, something warmer than professional. She hits send. Scene 2. Grace's waiting room. Marcus is sitting in one of the chairs. He is on time. For the first time in 8 months, he did not cancel or arrive late or reschedule. He is holding the folded piece of paper. He opens it. The Portland address has a single clean line drawn through it. Below it, in different handwriting smaller, slightly tilted a phone number. And beneath that, the same signature that has been there for 15 years. D. He folds it carefully, puts it back in his pocket. The inner door opens and the nurse calls his name. He stands, walks in. Scene 3. A waiting room in a federal building downtown. Leon sits in a plastic chair against a wall. He is wearing a gray suit that fits him well. His hands are in his lap, no notebook, no phone visible. He looks at the door across from him. Behind it, somewhere, is the beginning of a process that will take a long time and end with consequences he already knows the shape of. He does not look like a man who has been caught. He looks like a man who has arrived at something that was always waiting for him at the end of a road he chose, one decision at a time, over 20 years. The door opens. A clerk calls a name. Leon stands, walks through, the closing narration. Slow, measured. Like the last few sentences of a story told between people who are paying attention. He had spent 20 years being the best informed person in any room. He had never been told the most important things by the people closest to him. It turns out that information is not the same as truth, and the distance between them is exactly the size of the space where someone you trusted used to stand. The strongest person is not the one who is never betrayed. It's the one who, after being betrayed, still chooses the direction they actually want to go, not the direction that pain points them toward, the direction they choose. A pause, and then, simply, if this story stayed with you, if you've ever held a complicated truth about someone you needed to trust, or been the person who kept the truth back because you thought it was protecting someone, drop a comment. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us which moment landed. And if you want more stories that don't hand you easy answers, subscribe. We'll be here. Take care of yourselves. This literary work is intended purely as fiction. Any similarities to real individuals or events are coincidental and arise solely from the nature of storytelling. The author does not claim accuracy regarding real-world details and does not intend to portray real-life circumstances.
Marcus Vale controlled a city. He controlled contracts, decisions, outcomes. He was the most informed person in every room he walked into. And yet, the most important things, the things that shaped the last 15 years of his life, were decided for him by someone he never thought to question. That is not a story about crime. That is a story about trust, and the price of giving it without ever verifying it. Leon did not betray Marcus out of greed. He did not betray him for power or money or anything the rational mind easily recognizes as dangerous. He betrayed him out of love, distorted, suffocating, possessive love, the kind that tells itself it is protection while it quietly removes every exit. And that is the most important lesson this story carries. The most dangerous people in your life are rarely the ones who wish you harm. They are the ones who need you in a specific way and will quietly reshape your world to make sure you keep needing them back. Learn to tell the difference between someone who is loyal to you and someone who is loyal to their version of you. Those are not the same thing. The second lesson is about walls. Marcus built his perfectly, kept everything out for 15 years, stayed safe, stayed controlled, stayed alone. The walls that protect you at your most broken point are not meant to be permanent. At some point, the structure that saved you becomes the structure that limits you. Knowing when to take it down, that takes more courage than building it ever did. And the third lesson is the quietest one. Sonia saw his hand tremble and kept moving at exactly the same pace. She did not look away. She did not make it smaller by making it a moment. That is what real respect looks like. Not protecting someone from their own weakness. Treating them as whole, even when they are not. Strength is not the absence of fragility. Strength is continuing, clearly, honestly, without performance while the fragility is still there. That is what this story is actually about.